Hi there and welcome. There's a presumption of guilt because she's serving 15 whole life sentences for murdering and torturing babies. As I see it, there are three possible explanations for someone coming out with something like that in the current state of mainstream knowledge about the case. The first is that the person is engaging with the world from a mental universe in which 2 plus 2 is occasionally 4, but only in the same way that a broken analog clock, will show the correct time twice a day. The rest of the time, the product of 2 plus 2 can be and will be literally any number depending on the needs of the moment. I'm talking about someone who engages with the world from outside rationality. The second is that it is a posture maintained for a purely entrepreneurial reason. For example, if you are a reporter who now has a book written to cash in on the serial killer narrative to promote, or you happen to run a pro-guilt entertainment channel which is making money for you. The third is that the person in question, while pretending to be engaging in dialogue, is actually playing a deceitful one-sided power game, the payoff in which is anxiety or other negative emotion in those they draw into that mind game. This person, again, having no belief or commitment to what they are saying, merely adopts a posture calculated to generate the negative energy they need to feed off. Basically, an emotional predator flying under a flag of convenience. A personality disorder might be a fourth, but my sense is that this is functionally indistinguishable for the rest of us in dealing with these perversities from the more easily discerned impairment of mind we call insanity. Reference that impairment to the capacity for rational thought. I believe the best illustration is looking at the most quaintly English but conceptually accessible of the vast number of legal fictions which are the grammar of English law, the fabled man on the Clapham omnibus. The phrase these days is rarely heard in oral conversation outside of the upper echelons of the judiciary and the few remaining former cabinet ministers who merit the honorific term elder statesman. Lower down, legal professionals and our intellectually and culturally shrunken politicians prefer the safer, less romantic but arguably less conceptually accessible phrase reasonable man test to express the concept. Nonetheless, the phrase certainly abounds in law reports and formal legal texts. The man on the Clapham omnibus test probably does most of its day-to-day heavy lifting in assault trials, but is relevant to all legal questions where opinion is recognized as a factor. The essence of this legal fiction is the ordinary law-abiding citizen primarily preoccupied with their own life and concerns and going about their business accordingly. This fictional, emotionally uninvested, though morally engaged person then gives us a disinterested, ideal observer perspective as an impartial reference point on relevant questions in making and interpreting law and assessing facts. In relation to Miss Letby's case and conviction, the man on the Clapham omnibus would have taken a casual but purely rational interest in the breaking news story on 18th August 2023. As was the case with most of us, the decisive factors in his or her assessment of the conviction would likely have been the statistical table showing her presence at all the collapses and the description of the content of the confessional notes. How then could our ideal observer be expected to react to news from trusted sources 10 months later that the statistical table was a fraudulent and incomplete one, put together for the sole purpose of generating the belief that Miss Letby had been present for all deaths and collapses, which was far from being the case. And the alleged confessional notes had been written on the advice of a therapist employed by the same organization which invited the police to investigate her as a serial killer. On top of those bombshells, our ideal observer would have also learned that the key element of the circumstantial evidence linking Miss Letby to 8 of the collapses and deaths she had been charged with, door swipe data, was in error, and that the actual author of the paper relied upon to convict Miss Letby of the most lethal of her claimed attack methods was not only formally on record stating that his findings in that 1989 paper did not support her conviction and had been misrepresented to secure those convictions, but had taken the extraordinary step of appearing before the Court of Appeal on her behalf. Further, what impact could we reasonably expect the knowledge that the basis of the Court of Appeal's rejection of Miss Letby's application for leave to appeal was arcane procedural rules, entirely disconnected from any ordinarily understood concept of justice or fairness? The judicial position essentially being that the decisive thing was not that all the medical evidence presented to the court was deeply flawed, but that such information was already in existence at the time of her trial, so it could have been presented there, meaning it could not be a basis for allowing her to now appeal. On top of learning all that last summer, our man on the Clapham omnibus would have learned on 4th February that a team of the most eminent specialists in premature babies worldwide had reviewed all the medical files on the children Miss Letby was accused, then convicted of harming, and, in every single case, found the death or collapse explicable in terms of underlying health conditions in the baby and or poor care bordering on clinical negligence, and zero evidence to suggest any baby was attacked by Miss Letby or anyone else for that matter. Based on the characteristics given to this fictional person, defined by rationality, isn't it fair to say that in light of that information alone, i.e., even without knowledge of Jairam's lies, or Breary's Thirlwall revealed grudge about Datix, malice, and more lies, the man on the Clapham omnibus would now be likely to have neurons firing off like mad in those cells of the brain governing his something must be done social reflex. He might even be sufficiently energized by the information to be thinking about getting off that bus at the stop nearest his local MP's office to go and knock on the door. Would our ideal observer blithely remain stubbornly wedded to what was originally a purely disinterested, cursory assessment of the conviction back on the 18th of August 2023? If they did, could he or she continue in their pretensions of morally engaged but emotionally uninvested impartiality? As they were, for whatever reason, clearly no longer a disinterested observer, would it be wise to view any utterance made by them about the case with anything except the deepest skepticism? This neatly takes us back to the observation about functional insanity in the introduction to my previous video. An observation made with this Snowden individual, front and center in my mind. Some might think that a bit strong, but what is insanity except an absence of, or at least departure from, the constraints of rationality, even if only temporarily? If someone does not, at the very least, approximate the intellectual journey on the case we could reasonably expect our ideal observer on the Clapham omnibus to have made, that person is either labouring under a fairly profound impairment of mind or personality, or they are actively seeking to play the rest of us. In any of those cases, you need to really ask yourself what your objective is in engaging with them before continuing to do so. In the old days, it was commonly held that insanity is contagious. It was even an article of faith back in antiquity when, not having state organizations to take the insane off their hands and out of sight, they had a much more up-close and personal experience with the insane as an unavoidable part of everyday life. A conscious or unconscious distillation of that ancient wisdom perhaps informs Mark Twain's famous quote, "Never argue with an idiot. They will drag you down to their level and beat you through experience." It has to be said that, even outside the bounds of my current argument, that quote appears very applicable to the pro-guilters. Perhaps the most apt of all, though, in reference to these people, is a related quote attributed to Mark Twain but apparently disputed. And it goes like this: "No amount of evidence will ever persuade an idiot." This is just as applicable to the likes of Snowden as to the red top readers, because yes, you can be highly educated and remain an idiot. Just look at some of the things our leaders, the judiciary, and members of the upper classes in general have said and done down the years. I might be being unfair as to the native abilities of some of these people, though, as there is certainly contemporary evidence that curriculum and teaching methods can be just as readily tailored to narrowing the subject's moral and intellectual horizons as broadening them. As an example, apparently the writing, and more tragically, the actual reading of cursive or joined up writing, skills I personally acquired before I could even tell the time from an analog watch, are now beyond the average 20-something. In the same video, I believe, it was reported that young people also no longer have the attention span to actually read a whole book. That I couldn't credit, dismissed, until the former teacher reported how her career was derailed by her repeated efforts to introduce pupils to full-length books instead of excerpts. The bureaucrats who set these curriculums justify this on the basis that digesting short passages is all the pupils need to be able to do to pass the exams. It is also, of course, a most excellent method of putting people in a condition of information poverty and hamstringing any future efforts to change that state of affairs. People are sensing this too. Apparently, in culturally and economically marginalized inner-city Birmingham, switched-on individuals no longer speak of the schooling system, dryly referring to education instead as the fooling system. Their intuition is correct, but they don't know the half of it. To return to the question of engaging with those who remain pro-guilt even after the press conference on February 4th, it might be argued that openly challenging them is a means of flipping some of their audience. I am not convinced for this reason. Every adult with an IQ above room temperature will have been, at the very least, vaguely aware of national debate around Miss Letby's convictions even before February the 4th. If, after getting any sense of what was said at that press conference and by whom, a person is still willing to uncritically listen to the likes of Snowden, I think we need to ask ourselves if the campaign to free Miss Letby will be enhanced by the presence of such an individual. While on this visit to the moral and intellectual underbelly of society, nostrils tightly held, a further observation. Am I the only one who suspects that some of these twisted psyches seek to provoke the engagement of better minds and hearts as a means of counterfeiting relevance for their otherwise unsustainable and intellectually empty position, and by extension minds and sad lives? essentially exploiting the issue to manufacture a bogus legitimacy to what they have to say because they know that their native abilities are just not enough to get them taken seriously by others. How also do we know that pro-guilt doesn't include elements who have darker, more Machiavellian motives for engaging our time and mental resources? There are only ever 24 hours in a day, and our mental and emotional resources are decidedly finite between sleeps. Is it really so unlikely that those working overtime to keep Miss Letby stigmatized and imprisoned in order to protect certain individuals and institutions would factor those considerations into their own campaign? If we are spending energy, time, and fragile and finite mental resources trying to make sense of their specious, spurious, and total nonsense arguments for the purposes of rebuttal, that time, that energy, and those mental resources are not being spent on strategy and tactics to bring forward Miss Letby's release from prison. Some of you might think I'm going a bit deep there. Perhaps I am where some of the ordinary hate mongers are concerned. But if the judicial media cover-up is seen as important enough to justify spending literally millions on a sham public inquiry, you can be damned certain that fake accounts coming out of that big white building in Cheltenham are well represented among the pro-guilter trolls we have come to know and loathe. If expertise in manipulation of trust, human emotion, and the human mind were a PhD subject, every single person operating out of that building would have one. Make no mistake, they are an operational tool of the establishment, and for the establishment, the persons campaigning to free Miss Letby are a more imminent threat than the current and perennial bogeyman foreign enemy, Russia. The judicial media witch hunt against Miss Letby is just another version of hybrid war, and as persons seeking to help her, we are the enemy just as much as she is. If your personal politics are such that you are unable to countenance the idea that the British state could be quite that calculating in dealing with its own citizens, fine. You must, though, be able to see that even if redirecting and burning our time, energy, and resources in sterile activity was not a plan, it is necessarily the windfall result. As I said, there are only 24 hours in a day. Ultimately, it makes no difference whether they are actively seeking this outcome or it is accidental. The effect is the same. A further consideration, this time wholly above the tensions of partisan politics, is this. I sometimes wonder if the reason we entertain these jokers and charlatans is out of some misguided sense that it is the right thing to do to remain consistent with our liberal values. Do liberal values and a commitment to plurality and tolerance oblige us to slavishly listen to every opinion under the sun on a given subject? I don't think so. If a layperson comes expressing opinion in your field of professional expertise, depending on mood and available time, you might gently and indulgently correct them or give them short shrift along the lines of, "You don't know what you're talking about." You might even, after looking pointedly at them, just walk away without saying a word, thinking no more of it, and certainly without finding it necessary to explain yourself. If you did choose to explain yourself and they still persisted in their point of view, it is highly unlikely that your reaction would be a sudden compulsion to engage them in argument and defeat them. Why would such intolerance leave our conceit in our liberal values intact? Because we know ourselves to be better informed than the other person. It is a judgment call. We do not see their human dignity as any less than our own, but we know that in this particular area, they are like a child in relation to us. Is it really so different in dealing with the various types of pro-guilters? Every member of our community is better informed on Miss Letby's case than any pro-guilter. Just as the convictions could not have happened if Goss had allowed all relevant information to be presented to the jurors, so no pro-guilter, even the nutters, could argue for their position based on acknowledgement of all the information we know. For example, that Miss Letby was the quite possibly the most respected, confident, competent, and certainly most conscientious of the junior nurses, such that she was datexing people all over the place, including herself. That over 3 years of previous employment, there was no spike in deaths. That at least one greater spike in Nottingham the previous year took place. Miss Letby's successful grievance involving her parents, the post-mortems on 6 of the 7 murdered babies, the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health report and the external senior neonatologist review of the 17 deaths of autumn 2016, the fact that police saw nothing to suggest criminal activity in either of those reports, the machinations and lies of Jairam to persuade the police to change their minds and do an investigation. The investigation drawing a blank for 9 months until Breary lied to police about the first insulin result. The confessional notes being on the advice of the hospital's head therapist. The CPS rejecting proper statistical analysis. The judge refusing to allow defense and prosecution medical experts to take the stand together. The 2 2016 reports and much other relevant information being withheld from the jury. The abuse of door swipe data in 8 cases. And of course, the findings of the 14 world-leading experts that all the collapses are down to natural causes or clinical failings unrelated to Miss Letby's own work. They are only able to take their pro-guilt posture by choosing to be willfully ignorant of much of that information, or just pretending it isn't there. Why then is there a need to take them any more seriously than a woefully uninformed individual in any other area? Mockery is frankly the only rational reason I can think of for interacting with these people. But that doesn't seem appropriate while Miss Letby is still languishing in prison. Once she is out, I am personally going to take an obscene amount of pleasure in going after these people to remind them of just how much offense they caused, ask them just what they achieved from it, and generally subject them to merciless ridicule and abuse. For the moment, though, I'm going to just continue to ignore them. Okay, that's what I had to say today. As usual, please feel free to share your own thoughts and any information you think might be of interest in the comments below. And again, as usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.